Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to get even nerdier than we usually get, and we're going to talk about grammar, one of my favorite things. I've always been that one weird person who actually really enjoys grammar. I was an English major and I was probably the only person in the class who ever enjoyed diagramming sentences. So I thought today it might be kind of fun, at least for me, I hope for you as well, to go over a few grammar mistakes that I see quite commonly in writing, and this is both creative writing as well as basically any sort of writing. I see it on social media, I see it in content creation because I do content marketing. I see them all the time. Hopefully, if you guys make these mistakes, you can learn from this. You can either learn to recognize these things or maybe understand them a bit better if you knew they existed and you shouldn't be doing them, but you don't quite understand it enough to get out of the habit. And also, I would love if you would leave it in the comments below because I'm just gonna cover 5 in this video, but there are so many others. So if there are other ones that you've noticed in your own writing or in other people's writing that you wanna add to this list, leave them in the comments below and I might do another video about this in the future. But for starters, let's just start with one super nerdy video and I'll see if you guys actually enjoy this as much as I do because I'm already having fun. The first mistake that I find all the time in writing is the use of sentence fragments. Now this one's a bit tricky with creative writing because you actually can use them, you just need to be very intentional about them. And usually it's pretty obvious if it's more of a mistake or if it's just sort of a poorly chosen fragment as opposed to a fragment that actually really makes sense. Technically, grammatically, fragments are a mistake, but creative writing can break the rules occasionally. You just have to understand the rule in order to break it when it needs to be broken. I'm sure you've heard it before, but basically a full sentence is a subject and a verb. So the subject is a noun, so it's a person, place, or thing, and then a verb is an action word. She does something, and you can modify she, you can call her the pretty girl, or however many modifiers you want. You can have an adverb modifying a verb, and then you can have however many modifiers and clauses and phrases, etc. But basically your sentence needs to have a subject and a verb at its core, otherwise it is not a full sentence, it is actually a fragment. So I've come up with some examples. Please don't judge me on these examples because I just wrote them down really fast and I just want them to demonstrate the thing that I'm talking about. So don't judge me on the artistic quality of my examples, please. She swept remnants of shattered glass into the trash, ignoring the music they made as they met at the bottom. The last of that ridiculous set of wine glasses she never should have bought anyway. So here we have a full sentence followed by a fragment. The first sentence is a full sentence. You have she swept, and then the second part of the example is actually a fragment because even though you might notice that there is technically a noun and a verb in that sentence, the noun and the verb are actually part of a that clause. So that is not written because in English you can omit that in a that clause, but it's still a that clause. So that's not the main part of the sentence. The main part of the sentence is the last of that ridiculous set of wine glasses, and there is no verb there. In this case, there's really no reason to make this a fragment because you're not stylistically trying to change the rhythm of the reading. You're not trying to really emphasize something about, often it's used for dramatic emphasis, a fragment in creative writing, and that can be completely justifiable. But in this case, you've got this long kind of winding fragment. It makes no sense to make that a fragment. There's a lot of different things you could do to fix this, but one potential sort of easy fix would just be to say, she never should have bought that ridiculous set of wine glasses anyway. And then you have she never should have bought as the main part of the sentence. It can be confusing, especially when you have lots of different clauses and phrases because verbs can be used in clauses and verbs can be used in a way, in a phrase, in a modifying phrase, where it can seem like you do actually have some sort of action there, but just pay attention to the main part of the sentence. If you have a that or a which or a who or a where or any of those words, any of those conjunctions, then that's a clause. That's not actually part of the main sentence. And you need to make sure in the main part of the sentence you have a subject and a verb. And if you do decide to use a fragment and you decide that that's the very best way that you can convey what you're trying to convey, then just make sure it's very intentional and that it's not going to be misread as a mistaken fragment. While we're on the subject of clauses and phrases and all of that fun stuff, let's talk about some misplaced modifiers. Most of you have probably heard about this before, read about this before, about the dangers of misplaced modifiers, where it seems like a phrase that you're inserting into your sentence is actually modifying the wrong noun. And normally they're accompanied with these examples that are so ridiculous so that you really see the problem and it seems like, I would never make this mistake. This is so completely obvious. Pulling the car into the driveway, the dog let loose a chorus of barks at his arrival. It's implying that the dog is pulling the car into the driveway. Not what you want, very ridiculous, actually impossible unless you're writing a really funny fantasy. So you need to either change the dog to the person who's pulling the car into the driveway, so change the subject of the sentence, or you could move the modifier somewhere else. There's lots of things you can do to fix that. It's not always this obvious though. If it were, then it wouldn't be nearly as common a mistake. Sometimes it's much more sneaky, and I've tried to write an example that kind of sneaks one in a little bit more where you might not necessarily expect it. After being away for so long, his parents wouldn't expect him to turn up like this, unannounced. So in this case, especially if you would put it in the context of a story, it seems pretty obvious what that modifier is describing. He is the one who has been away for so long. But actually what that sentence is implying is that his parents have been away for so long, which completely flips it. One potential easy fix for this would just be to say, after so many years, his parents wouldn't expect him, because it's so many years. That just describes the time past. It's for him, it's for his parents as well. It's not using that be word, being away, because being away is what he is doing, whoever this he is. These misplaced modifiers can range from being just really annoying to being kind of confusing to where it makes the reader have to reread a sentence, to being completely wrong and implying the wrong thing about the wrong character. Let's talk about some comma splices next. Technically this is punctuation, but it kind of factors in with grammar because it often is kind of a result of poor grammar or a result of, someone who doesn't quite know grammatically what to do with a sentence. So basically a comma splice is when you put a comma in a sentence where it doesn't belong. I'm not really sure where this idea came from, but I have heard more than one person say that a comma is inserted when you have a pause in a sentence. And that's so not right. Most of the time where commas are supposed to be are places where you would naturally pause, so sometimes this lines up because you pause when you read a comma, but not necessarily you put a comma where you would pause. Commas really do have specific roles in the sentence. They have many of them, which is why it's quite confusing. And then there are some situations when people would kind of debate whether or not a comma is needed, but most of the time it's actually pretty simple and it doesn't really matter about those little, debatable moments. What you really need to focus on are the times when it's not debatable, when it's just you need a comma or you don't need a comma. Now I could make a whole video on this. I could probably make 10 videos on this, so I'm not going to go into intense detail about all the moments when you need or don't need a comma, but I've come up with a couple of examples here in different types of sentences so that you can kind of see what I'm talking about and maybe some potential fixes. She knew in her heart that nothing would ever be the same again. So this is a potential situation when someone might want to put a comma because as they're reading, for dramatic emphasis, you really want to pause there. But a comma is just not what you need to use here. If you really want something, if you don't want to just write the sentence without anything, then maybe a potential fix would be to use a colon. So she knew it in her heart, add it so that you have a full sentence. She knew it in her heart, nothing would ever be the same again. And then you have that pause, you have that dramatic tension within the sentence. You really emphasize nothing would ever be the same again, but you don't throw a random comma in there that doesn't need to be there. Example number 2, the picture that he had kept all this time meant nothing anymore. So in this case, again, for dramatic tension, you might want to put those commas there. You might want to really emphasize that he had kept all this time. But this is the second example of a that clause. I don't know why I did 2 that clause examples, but that clauses do not need commas. In fact, it's incorrect to use a comma with that clause. The easiest way to fix this one would just be to take out the commas. They're really not useful and it really doesn't add that much dramatic tension to pause. But if you really, really want to draw attention to this, you could also just change it to a different type of phrase. So instead of a that clause, you could change it to a descriptive phrase. So for example, the picture, the precious memory that he had kept all this time, meant nothing anymore. So then you add the precious memory, it becomes another noun, so it becomes a descriptive phrase, and therefore you can put it in commas because a descriptive phrase can be put in commas rather than a that clause. I hope that makes sense. There's a lot of different workarounds for these situations, but I think just the biggest thing is to be aware of them, because if you're not aware that you're using a comma splice, you're not going to be able to know how to fix it. But the fun thing with language is that there's so many different types of phrasing that you can use, and in creative writing, especially because you do have the option of using a stylistic fragment, you do have the option of sort of tweaking language in a way that you wouldn't be able to do in formal writing, but you can in creative writing. It doesn't mean that you have the excuse to use a bunch of comma splices and make a bunch of mistakes though, because that just becomes very confusing. And comma splices in particular can actually really change the meaning of a sentence, and it can be really just confusing for a reader if they find a random comma in the middle of a sentence. This one is really specific, but the next thing that I want to talk about is of versus have. And specifically, no one ever mixes these two words up except when you're using conditional words like could or would or should. So I'm sure you've seen or read somewhere, maybe even just on Instagram or Facebook or something, but you've seen someone write should of, O-F. This is never right, never. Should of, could of, would of, they're never ever ever right. Scratch them out of your brain, take them out of your writing. They're literally 0% of the time going to be correct. What this is actually trying to say is should have, would have, could have. And the reason why so many people, I think, mix it up in their heads is because in spoken language, you would use a contraction. So you would say should've, would've, could've. And that's how we often say it in speech, or even shoulda, woulda, coulda, because when you're speaking really quickly, sometimes it comes out kind of like that. So when you're writing, often people think that what you're actually saying and what this is actually supposed to be is of. This is a common mistake. It's made by native English speakers, and it's just because of speech. However, if you write it in your novel or in your short story or in your poem, unless of course it's an intentional thing in dialogue, for example, you have a character who you want to make this mistake, unless it's one of those rare examples of an intentional should of, which is like nails on a chalkboard for me, then you don't need to write it. Please don't write it. You can write should have, the contraction, because contractions are okay, and they're even encouraged when you're writing dialogue and stuff, of course. But also you can write should have. And if you're ever stuck and you're trying to think, was it of or was it have? I can't remember. Just take out the conditional word. So instead of could have done, say have done. Is it could of done, of done? I of done something? Doesn't make sense. Have done makes sense. Those go together. So could have done. And that's like an easy way to remember it. At least it's easy for me. I don't know if it helps you or if it's just easier to ingrain the word have in your head, but there's a little trick if you need it. And that trick is going to be very useful for the last thing on this list, which is the misuse of nominative versus objective pronouns. Examples of nominative pronouns are I, she, he, we, they. Some examples of objective pronouns would be me, her, him, us, them. And normally for native or fluent speakers of English, it makes pretty much easy sense where in a sentence you use each one of these. Nominative are normally in the subject part of the sentence. Objective are the objects of something in the sentence. For example, the object of a preposition is the most common one. And in most cases, it's pretty easy to just feel which one you need. You don't have to think about it. But there are specific cases when it's quite common actually for native and fluent speakers of English to use the wrong one, especially when you have groups or pairings of different nouns and pronouns, because the further away that word gets from its original source, the less clear it can sometimes be which one is the more natural way to do it, so which one is correct. So I have a couple of examples, and these are very much the way that I hear this and see this written incorrectly sometimes. Her and Rachel go to yoga every Saturday. So in this case, you have the pronoun her paired with a name, so a proper noun, Rachel. And because her is more separate from its actual role in the sentence because of and Rachel being there, a lot of people would make the mistake and say her because it seems very much like it's going on its own. But in fact, it's the subject of the sentence still. A really easy way to trick yourself into giving yourself the right answer is to just take out and Rachel. Her goes to yoga every Saturday. Nope, it's definitely she. That is unquestionable. She goes to yoga. Okay, so this is seeming pretty easy. The second example, I hope, will be a little bit sneakier. If it were up to Michael and I, we would have already left. So here we have two pronouns. We have the nominative pronoun I and the nominative pronoun we. And we is correct. It is the nominative pronoun. It's the subject of the sentence. We would have already left. That is completely correct. But the I is the problem here. It is just begging to be nominative because it's right next to we. Michael and I is we, so therefore it seems like Michael and I, it's the subject of the sentence, so it needs to be I. But actually, the role that it's playing in the sentence is the object of to, if it were up to Michael and I. So let's do our little trick. Let's take out Michael and. If it were up to I, nope, definitely me. Definitely me. If it were up to me. So in this case, it becomes a lot more obvious because you have the two right next to the object. So it's very clear it needs to be me without that Michael and. So it doesn't matter that Michael and I, as you know, people are the same thing as we. They're playing different roles in the sentence, and therefore in this case, it needs to be objective. If you're ever in doubt, then the easiest thing to do is just to boil down the sentence to the absolute bare bones and just see what feels right then. Because normally if you take out those proper nouns, if you take out, you know, adjectives or adverbs, descriptors that are in there, take out phrases and clauses that don't need to be there and just boil it down to the bare bones of the sentence, it's usually pretty obvious. Not always, sometimes it's a bit more complicated than that, but normally it's pretty obvious once you take out the more confusing sort of additions to the sentence. So those are the 5 grammar mistakes that I have chosen to talk about in this video, but definitely let me know in the comments below and by liking this video if you enjoyed it, if you're interested in this topic. I would love to do more sort of nerdy grammar videos like this, or punctuation or sentence structure or whatever else we can do. But you know, I'm not gonna make them if you're not interested, if you're not as into the subject as I am. So definitely do let me know. And if there are specific grammar questions that you want me to talk about in a future video, let me know that in the comments below, or shoot me a message on Twitter or Instagram, and I can definitely write them down and put them in a future video. If you're not subscribed already, please do be sure to subscribe to this channel. I have more grammar videos, but also writing videos, bookish videos. You can check out some of my playlists on my channel to sort of get a taste of what I do here. And if you're interested, be sure to subscribe. Be sure to turn on notifications as well with the bell. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon in another Writerly video.